In this session, we will continue our discussion on labor demand, and today we want to combine the previous understanding based on the concept of isoquants and isocosts, and we want to see the firm's optimal combination of inputs in the long run. Recall that the production function of this firm is given by output or Q equal to the combination of capital and labor. And using the isoquants and isocost curves, we now want to find the combination mix of the two inputs for the firm to minimize costs so that the firm can maximize its profit. Recall also that earlier we have discussed about how to compute the slope of the isoquant as well as the slope of the isocost. Looking at this diagram, we find that a firm cost of producing Q0 units of output by using the capital labor combination at point P. So this is point P, and here we find where the isoquant Q0 is tangential to the isocost as indicated by this line. And this tangential point given by point P gives us the cost minimizing input combination for this firm. Therefore, as indicated here, the firm would utilize 175 units of capital and also 100 workers to produce Q0 quantity of output. All other capital labor combinations, such as those given by point A and B, lie on a higher isocost curve. Point A and point B are not the optimal combination of inputs for this firm. Because if we look at point A, over here, point A is on the much higher isocost. Yet, at point A, the firm is still producing the same amount of output given by Q0 here. The firm is better off to choose the input mix given by point P here because the firm is still producing Q0 but using a much lower cost outlay as indicated by the lower isocost. The same in the case of point B over here. Point B is on the much higher isocost, yet this input mix as indicated by point B is still producing Q0 quantity of output. Therefore again, the firm is better off to choose the input mix as indicated by point P, which is the tangential point. So this is the basic theoretical guide for the firm to decide in terms of the input mix between capital and labor to minimize its production costs. So what we learned in that discussion is the importance of cost minimization to a firm so that the firm could maximize its profit. We have identified earlier that the cost minimization to produce Q0 amount of outputs is given by point P. At point P, we find that the slope of the isocost is equal to the slope of the isoquant. So if we recall, the slope of the isocost is the input price ratio over here, W over R. This is the cost of the isocost. And the slope of the isoquants is the marginal product of worker over marginal product of capital. This is the tangential point position at which the slope of the isoquant is equal to the slope of the isocost. We can rearrange this equation so that we can re-express it as indicated here. And what we can say from this expression is that in order to minimize the cost, the dollar cost of producing outputs using worker is equal to the dollar cost of producing output using capital. And therefore, if the marginal product of worker is equal to 20 and wage rate is 10, we can find that this will give us 2. That means the last dollar spent on labor yield 2 units of output. So this is another way how we can re-express the position of the tangential point as indicated in the diagram earlier. Recall that profit maximizing conditions imply cost minimization, but cost minimization needs not imply profit maximization. This point indicates that one of the conditions to maximize profit is to ensure cost minimization. However, even when a firm achieves the cost minimization, not necessarily the firm may achieve profit maximization. So again, when we look at the input mix that we have, that is capital and labor, for this expression or this equation, we say that this is the rule that we use in order to identify the optimal number of workers to hire, where wage rate equals the value of marginal product of worker as given by this expression. And over here, this is the condition the firm needs to fulfill in order to identify the optimal amount of capital in its production process. R is the price of capital equal price times the marginal product of capital. This expression is actually the value of marginal product of capital. So both expressions above implies cost minimization. Again, when we rearrange this expression, we can get to this point. Moving on to this diagram is to show the impact of a wage reduction holding cost constant, which is not really the case most of the time in reality. Let's look at this diagram and let's say Q0 is the initial level of output produced as indicated by this isoquant. And this is the initial isocost, where along this isocost, the wage rate is at W0. At that point, so given isoquants Q0 and this isocost, point P gives us the tangential point, indicating the optimal input mix to produce Q0. That is 75 unit of capital and also 25 unit of workers. Now let's say that there is a reduction in the wage rate. How we can show the effect of wage reduction? Recall that the slope of our isocost is the input price ratio given by W over R. So this is the slope of the isocost. Assuming that the price of capital is constant, if we say that there is a reduction in the wage rate, so what will happen here is the ratio now becoming smaller. That will be represented by a much flatter isocost. Therefore, we can say that a wage reduction would flatten the isocost curves. So this is one implication of the wage reduction. If the firm were to maintain the initial cost outlay to be constant at C0, that means the isocost would rotate around C0 on this point. And now the optimal point has moved from point P to point R. R now is the new optimal point. However, when there is a change in the wage rate, such as the wage rate declines from W0 to W1, as indicated here, from W0 to W1, a profit maximizing firm generally does not hold its cost outlay constant. The cost incurred by the firm before and after wage change are not necessarily to be the same, because now the firm can adjust both inputs, capital and labor, in consideration of the change in the wage rate. So what this diagram tells us is one possibility: if the firm wants to maintain the same cost outlay, then the change in the wage rate reduction is indicated by a rotation of the isocost. However, that is not usually the normal case. So what is more realistic in the case of a wage reduction? Let's see this diagram. So again, we want to understand the impact of wage reduction on the output and input mix combination. First, let's focus on the left side diagram. What we have in this diagram is our marginal cost curve, and this is the demand of the output of the firm indicated by this horizontal line, because this firm is operating in a pure competition, price equal to marginal revenue, and this is also the demand curve faced by the firm. And this is the initial point where price equal to marginal cost or marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, which give us the profit maximizing output level for this firm initially. Now we make a case where there is a reduction in the wage rate. Wage is a cost related to labor. Now, because of the wage reduction, means that it would reduce the cost of production, and that's captured by a reduction in the marginal cost. So we can capture that by, let's say, you are still producing 100 unit of outputs. However, because of reduction in the cost of your labor, so then it will be indicated by the downward shift of the marginal cost curve over here. So overall, this is the new marginal cost curve after we take into account the effect of the wage reduction. So what happened? As shown here, a wage reduction would mean that the firm now can hire more workers, and therefore the firm can increase its output from 100 to 150 unit of outputs. So this is one story based on the marginal revenue, marginal cost analysis, taking into account the effect of wage reduction. Now let's see the right side diagram. This isocont shows us the initial output produced by the firm earlier. We start by saying that the firm is producing 100 unit of outputs initially. Taking into account the effect of the wage reduction, what happened is that there is a jump in the output produced by the firm to 150 units. And the increase in the outputs is shown in this diagram by a much higher isocons over here. This is an isocon showing much higher amount of output produced, because all points along these isocons means 150 units of output. This isocost is the initial isocost before any change in the wage rate. However, when there is a reduction in the wage rate, we know that that would flatten our isocost. But here, because we are no longer considering that this firm would maintain the same cost outlay, therefore, you will find that this new isocost is becoming flattened, but it is not rotating on one single point at this point, for example. No. We are redrawing the position of this new isocost as illustrated here. What it means here is that we are now no longer maintain the same cost outlay as in the initial position. And given this new isocost, we get a new tangential point as indicated by point R here. So there is a change in the tangential point from point P to point R. What do we find at point R, the new tangential point? We find that the employment level has increased from 25 to 50. So this is one thing we find over here. What about capital? There is also a much higher amount of capital considered by this firm to produce 150 units of outputs in this case. So what we can say from that observation is as follows. Given the reduction in the wage rate, we find that employment would increase from 25 to 50. However, what about capital? Capital may increase or decrease when there is a change in the wage rate. Because first, remember that this is a long run analysis where capital now is also a variable input. The capital may increase or decrease. Firm may use more capital when they have more workers. That's logical. As you are hiring more workers, you may need to have more machines so that your workers also can work with these machines. So this is one possibility. Another possibility is that firm may switch to labor-intensive production. Thus, capital may decrease. So this is another possibility. Nonetheless, in this diagram per se, we find that there is an increase in the level of employment as well as increase in the amount of capital intake by this firm. This is possible as indicated by the first reason here, over here. But there is also a possibility that the firm may reduce its capital when the firm finds it is cheaper to move to a more labor intensive production. So such possibility is possible, and let's say we can show that by something like this, where I draw another new isocos like this. Let's say this is, I put point T. Let's say T is the tangential point. Over here, see that the firm now hires more workers, and in terms of capital, it is much lower than the initial amount of capital. That's also a possibility. So what happened in the case of a long run production process, whenever there is a change in the wage rate, there are two possible effects taken place in the analysis. The first effect is called the substitution effect, and the second one is called the scale effect. So what we can see from this diagram is the step that we can take to isolate or to decompose the substitution effect and the scale effect. And this is based on the earlier analysis where we have a case of a reduction in the wage rate. So what happened in the earlier analysis is that when there is a reduction in the wage rate, there is a change in the tangential point from P to R. Now let's capture the scale effect and the substitution effect. Before we do that, let's first understand what happened when there is a change in the wage rate to the firm's cost structure. To be more specific, let's say there is a reduction in the wage rate. A wage reduction would reduce the price of labor relative to capital, resulting in the adjustment in the input mix, where the firm may hire more labor relative to capital. The firm may be more labor intensive, and this represents the substitution effect. The second effect of a wage reduction is it would decrease the marginal cost to the firm, thus making the firm to produce more outputs. And this is indicated by the scale effect. In our earlier analysis, as indicated by this diagram, this is where we have the scale effect, where when there is a reduction in the wage rate, that means the marginal cost now shift downward, and wage cut therefore would mean the firm has lower cost of production and the firm now would produce more outputs. This is the scale effect. So going back to this figure, from the two possible effects that we have identified, in the figure, due to a decrease in the wage rate, the isocost becomes flatter and we have a new tangential point. Okay, that's clear. So the isocost becomes flatter and we have a new tangential point at point R. So now we want to decompose, taking into account the substitution and the scale effect. To decompose the scale effect, first we need to draw a parallel line as indicated by DD here, where this line is parallel to the original isocost. When we draw line DD, this is where we assume that the wage rate is constant, and what happened here is we get a new tangential point Q, and therefore the movement from P to Q gives us the scale effect. The scale effect here means that the firm is now producing more output, and the effect of this is a much higher demand for worker from 25 to 40 workers. That's the scale effect. The substitution effect is captured by the movement from point Q to R. This is the substitution effect. It shows what happened when, due to the lower wage rate, that would make the firm to adjust its input mix by holding the capital constant. Now the firm become more labor intensive. The firm now would further increase its intakes of worker from 40 to 50 workers. And notice also that there is a decrease in the unit of capital intake by the firm due to this substitution effect. From the discussion, we find that both the scale effect and substitution effect would be there when there is a change in the wage rate. What we are interested to know is which effect would dominate. In the case where the scale effect is more dominant than the substitution effect, let's say the scale effect is more dominant than the substitution effect, I write SUB for substitution effect. In this case, you will find that the firm would hire more capital. But if the scale effect is less than the substitution effect, the firm would hire more worker relative to capital. So this is what we find from this analysis. Inshallah, I'll see you again in the next topic. See you. Wassalam.